The prairie was silent that night, the kind of silence that only comes when winter has stolen the last hint of warmth from the land. The wind swept low across the plains, carrying needles of ice that cut through even the thickest coats. The moon was a pale lantern in the sky, casting long shadows over the frozen earth. Most folks in town were huddled inside their homes, shutters closed tight against the cold. Only the sound of creaking wood and distant coyotes broke the stillness. Riding slowly along the empty road was a lone cowboy, his broad hat pulled low, scarf wrapped tightly across his face. His horse snorted clouds of steam with every breath, hooves crunching against the frosted ground. He had been on the trail since dawn, carrying with him the weight of solitude that had followed him for years. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp but tired, eyes that had seen too much loss to believe the world had much kindness left in it. As he guided his horse past the edge of town, a faint sound carried on the wind. At first he thought it was nothing more than the creak of a barn door in the storm. But then he heard it again, a soft, broken whimper. He pulled on the reins, pausing, listening. The prairie was too still for such a sound. With a frown he turned his horse toward the old barn that stood crooked against the edge of the field, half forgotten and sagging with age. Inside, the air was colder than outside, thick with the smell of hay and dust. He pushed the door open carefully, the hinges groaning loud in the silence. At first his eyes adjusted only to shadows. Then he saw them. In the far corner, huddled together beneath a thin, torn blanket, were two figures. A woman, her hair tangled, her face pale and worn, and beside her a little girl no older than 6 or 7. Their lips trembled, their arms wrapped tight around each other, as if their embrace alone could fight off the cold. The girl's small hand clutched the fabric desperately, her tiny frame shivering against her mother's chest. The cowboy froze, his breath catching. He had seen hardship before. Families broken by debt, men brought low by drink, women left to fend for themselves in a world that rarely forgave weakness. But there was something about this sight that pierced deeper. Maybe it was the girl's wide, hollow eyes, or maybe it was the woman's stubborn silence as she noticed him, refusing to beg, refusing to speak. He felt something stir inside him, something he thought had long since been buried. Memories of another winter, another night when he had lost someone he loved, clawed at him. The loneliness he had carried for years pressed heavy on his chest, but now it mingled with something else, compassion and a quiet anger at the cruelty of a town that would leave a widow and child to freeze in a barn. The woman finally whispered, her voice raw, "If you've come to laugh, you've had your look. Leave us be." Her words cut him deeper than he expected. No plea for help, no demand, only the weary resignation of someone who had learned the world would never offer kindness. He stood there a long moment, torn. He was a man who kept to himself, who had built walls around his life and his heart. Taking one step toward them meant opening a door he had sworn to keep shut. But as the girl coughed, her small body shuddering violently, he knew the choice was no longer his to make. The cold pressed in around him, the wind howled through the cracks in the wood, and still he stood, staring at them. His hand hovered near the door. He could leave, pretend he never saw, ride back to the warmth of his cabin. But his boots didn't move. The widow's eyes met his defiant, yet breaking, and in that moment, the question burned in him, would he walk away, or step into a storm that might change his life forever? The cowboy's hand tightened around the doorframe as the cold wind howled through the barn. But finally he let out a sharp breath and made his choice. He dropped the heavy bundle of wood from his saddle near the center of the barn. The thud startled the little girl, who clung tighter to her mother. The widow's eyes narrowed, filled with suspicion. Without a word, he knelt down, pulled a knife from his belt, and began shaving thin curls of kindling. The steady scrape of steel against wood broke the silence. Soon a small pile grew, and with practiced hands he struck flint. A spark caught, then another, until a tiny flame licked upward. He leaned close, coaxing it gently until it grew. The firelight flickered across the barn walls, casting warm shadows that battled the bitter cold. The widow shifted slightly, pulling her daughter closer, as if uncertain whether to accept this act of mercy. Finally her voice came, low and edged with mistrust. "Why are you helping us?" The cowboy didn't look up immediately. He fed another stick into the flame, watching it catch before answering. "Because no one else did." The words were simple, but they carried weight. He wasn't a man known for kindness. At least not anymore, but something in him refused to let a child freeze, while he had the means to stop it. The little girl peeked at him over her mother's shoulder, her wide eyes reflecting the fire. Her lips trembled as she whispered, almost inaudible, "Mama, it's warm." That tiny voice, fragile and innocent, pierced through the tension like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The widow's body eased slightly, though her gaze never left the cowboy. They sat in silence at first, listening to the crackle of fire and the groan of the storm outside. But slowly the warmth began to loosen more than just frozen limbs. The cowboy broke the quiet with a low voice. "I've spent too many nights on the trail alone, wind biting at my back, no soul for company but my horse. Tonight I reckoned I'd ride home the same. Didn't expect to find you here." The widow's eyes flickered with something between caution and pain. After a long pause, she replied, "We had nowhere else to go. My husband left us with debts I couldn't pay. The landlord threw us out. Folks in town turned their eyes away." She shook her head, bitterness cracking through her tone. "Out here, mercy costs more than coin. And I had nothing left to trade." The fire popped, and for a moment the only sound was the little girl humming faintly, her head resting against her mother's arm. The cowboy's jaw tightened. He knew too well the cruelty of men who measured worth in gold and land. "That ain't right," he muttered, almost to himself. Her suspicion lingered, though the hard edges of her voice softened. "Men don't do something for nothing. What do you want from us?" He met her gaze then, steady and unwavering. "Nothing. Just for you both to see another sunrise." The girl shifted closer to the fire, and the faintest smile touched her lips. It startled her mother to see it, her child smiling for the first time in days. Something fragile moved inside her chest, something she had thought was long buried. Hope. The night wore on, and the three of them shared the fire. Stories, fragmented and hesitant, trickled out between the sparks. The cowboy spoke of loss, how death had taken someone dear, and left him with only empty silence. The widow spoke of betrayal, and the weight of being left behind, of scraping by until even scraping wasn't enough. They did not tell everything. Not yet, but in the glow of the firelight, the walls of suspicion began to crumble. What had begun as desperation slowly turned into something else, a fragile trust, fragile as the flame that warmed them. And as the storm raged outside, the three of them sat closer than strangers should, bound by warmth, silence, and the faint beginnings of something neither of them could name. By morning the storm had passed, but another kind of storm had begun to stir in town. Whispers traveled faster than the prairie wind. At the general store, at the saloon by the church steps, it was on every lip. The cowboy gave shelter to that widow and her child, took him into his barn, built him a fire. A man like him, throwing away his pride like that. Laughter followed the whispers, sharp and cruel. The banker, tall and sharp-eyed, leaned against the hitching post outside his office, smirking at every mention, his voice cut above the rest, dripping with mockery. "He's got a good ranch, a strong back, and what's he do with it? Wastes it on a widow who'll only drag him down. A girl with debts and a brat in tow. He's a fool if he thinks pity pays bills." The townsfolk chuckled, eager to stay on the banker's good side. Their jeers grew like a chorus, echoing in every corner of the dusty street. Back at the barn, the widow sat by the dying fire, clutching her daughter to her chest. Though warmth lingered in the air, her heart felt colder than ever. She had heard the whispers before, long before last night, whispers that a woman like her was nothing but a burden. When the cowboy stepped outside to tend his horse, she rose quietly. She gathered the thin blanket around her shoulders, and tugged her daughter's small hand. Her eyes were downcast, heavy with shame, as if every word from town had found its mark. The door creaked as she opened it, but his voice stopped her in her tracks. Where are you going? She froze, her daughter half hidden behind her skirt. We can't stay. Folks are right, you've done enough, more than anyone else would. We'll only bring you trouble. The cowboy took a step forward, his boots crunching softly against the dirt floor. His gaze was steady, unflinching. You think I give a damn what they say? Her eyes welled, but she shook her head. I won't be the weight that breaks you. His hand gripped the door frame beside her, firm but not cruel. His voice was low, steady as stone. Listen to me. I won't let you face the cold again. Not while I've got breath left in me. Silence filled the barn, thick and heavy. The little girl looked up at him with wide eyes, her small fingers clutching tighter at her mother's dress. The widow's lips parted as if to protest, but the words never came. For the first time in years, someone wasn't turning her away. For the first time, someone had stood between her and the world's cruelty. But outside, the conflict only grew. The banker's smirk widened each time a rumor spread. At the saloon, men joked about how the cowboy had thrown his pride in the dirt for a widow who should have been left to freeze. Every sneer, every laugh was meant to shame him back into silence, back into the hard, lonely man he'd once been. Yet when he returned to the barn, and found the widow still there, hesitant, trembling, but still there, something unspoken sparked between them. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something deeper, roar. A bond forged in defiance. The world scorned them both. The world said they didn't belong, that together they'd only fall. But as the little girl nestled close to the fire and the widow's shoulders eased, the cowboy knew the truth. What tied them together was stronger than whispers, stronger than mockery. Something unspoken, fragile and fierce burned between them. Something the world could not understand, but he would fight to protect. The road to the ranch was long and dusty, stretching beneath a sky painted in the pale gold of late afternoon. The cowboy rode ahead, reins loose in his hands, glancing back now and then at the widow and her little girl. They followed quietly, bundled against the lingering chill, yet there was something different in their faces, no longer just fear, but the fragile spark of possibility. When they reached the ranch, the land opened wide before them. Weathered fences, fields touched by frost, and a sturdy house that bore the marks of years of solitude. It wasn't much to boast of, but it was solid, dependable, like the man who called it home. For the widow, the place was overwhelming in its silence. No angry creditors banging on doors, no muttered insults from neighbors, just open air, and the low nickering of horses. The little girl's eyes widened as she spotted the corral, where a chestnut horse pawed at the dirt. She tugged at her mother's hand, then broke free with a burst of laughter, clear, unguarded, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The cowboy paused mid-step, caught off guard by the sound. He hadn't heard laughter on this land in years, not since, before loss had carved him hollow. His throat tightened as he watched the child reach out a hand toward the horse, giggling when the animal lowered its head, curious and gentle. That night, the widow insisted on cooking. The kitchen, long unused for more than simple meals, filled with the smell of bread and stew. She moved about the room with quiet determination, her hands working with practiced care. The cowboy sat at the table, unused to the sight of another soul filling the empty space. He found himself stealing glances, not of desire, but of recognition. She was a woman trying to rebuild from ashes, just as he had once tried and failed. Days turned into a rhythm. The widow swept floors, tended hens, and mended old curtains. The girl followed the cowboy as he worked the ranch, her small voice asking endless questions, her tiny boots stomping through the dust. He answered each one with patience, sometimes even a smile tugging at his lips. But it was in the evenings that the bond truly deepened. They would sit outside beneath the stars, a lantern flickering at their side. The widow spoke of her struggles, debts that crushed her, neighbors who looked away when she begged for help. The cowboy, in turn, shared pieces of his past. His voice was steady, but the pain lingered in every pause. A family once lost, laughter buried beneath grief, long nights where silence had been his only companion. She listened, not with pity, but with understanding, and he, for the first time in years, felt seen. One evening, the little girl crawled into his lap, her tiny hands clutching at his shirt. She looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes, and asked the question that struck him harder than any blow. "Can we stay here?" The cowboy froze, heart pounding in his chest. The words were so simple, so innocent, yet they carried the weight of everything he had thought he'd lost: home, family, belonging. His rough hand rested gently on the girl's shoulder, his eyes meeting the widow's across the lantern glow. She looked back at him, uncertain, hopeful, afraid to hope too much. He didn't speak right away, because he knew once he did, there would be no turning back. But inside, something had already shifted. Where once there was emptiness, he now saw the faint outline of something he thought the prairie had long stolen from him. A family, fragile but real, waiting to be claimed. The sun had barely climbed above the horizon when the first rumble of hooves echoed through the town square. The banker, a man whose eyes glinted with the cold satisfaction of power, rode in with a small entourage. His polished boots struck the cobblestones as he dismounted, posture rigid, a ledger clutched tightly in his hand. He didn't bother with greetings. "You owe me," he said, voice sharp enough to cut through the morning air. "The debt must be settled. She leaves with me today." A hush fell over the square. The widow stood at the center, her thin shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, the little girl clutching her hand. Fear clung to her like a second skin, but there was also a spark of hope, fragile yet persistent. The townsfolk, curious and judgmental, leaned forward, murmurs swirling like dust in a dry wind. Then came the cowboy. He stepped into the square, spurs jangling softly, the brim of his hat casting a shadow over his weathered face. At first he was calm, almost detached, as though weighing every word, every step. His gaze swept across the banker, the townsfolk, the widow. "She's under my protection," he said, his voice low but unwavering. For a moment the banker laughed, a dry, cruel sound meant to intimidate. Protection, from a lone rancher. But the cowboy didn't flinch. Instead he moved closer, hands relaxed but ready, posture unyielding. The townsfolk sensed the shift, the quiet authority radiating from a man who had seen the worst of the world, and refused to bend to it. The mocking whispers faltered, eyes widened, some dared to stare in awe, others shifted nervously. "You will leave her alone," the cowboy continued, his tone hardening, "or you will face more than just words." He didn't brandish a weapon, didn't need to. His presence alone carried the weight of storms weathered, land defended, and a heart that would not yield to cruelty. The banker faltered, pride and greed warred within him, but the intensity in the cowboy's gaze told a story he could not erase. Then, in a quiet motion that carried louder than any shout, the cowboy drew a folded paper from his coat and handed it to the widow. She unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the inked lines, the corners of the paper trembling in her hands. It was a deed, part of his land, a gift of freedom and stability, a promise written in soil and sweat. She gasped, the tears brimming first as disbelief, then spilling into a torrent of relief and gratitude. The townsfolk watched silently, as she sank to her knees, clutching the paper to her chest. The little girl ran to her mother, burying her face into the folds of her shawl. In that moment, the square seemed to shrink, the world narrowing to a circle of warmth around them, a barrier against all the cold that had threatened to sweep them away. The cowboy knelt beside her, not to diminish his authority, but to meet her eye to eye, to offer more than protection. "I've fought to keep you safe," he said softly, voice low with emotion, "but I want more than that. Will you be my wife?" There was no pity in his question, no obligation, only the steady truth of respect and love that had grown in the quiet of his ranch, under the stars and in shared silence. She looked up, her tears still glistening, heart pounding like a drum of hope. Her voice came in a whisper, trembling but certain. Yes. Relief, joy, and an unspoken promise hung in the air, heavier than any threat the world could throw. The banker, beaten without a fight, retreated, muttering, while the townsfolk slowly dispersed, leaving only admiration in their wake. The cowboy rose, extending his hand, and together they turned toward the horizon. The fire of confrontation had passed, replaced by the warmth of new beginnings. The land, the deed, the promise, they were more than gifts. They were a testament to courage, love, and the refusal to bow to the harshness of the world. The morning air was crisp, tinged with the scent of wild grass and sage. The prairie stretched endlessly, a golden sea beneath a sky painted with soft hues of dawn. There was no grand hall, no ornate decorations, only the open land, the whisper of wind through the tall grass, and the quiet murmur of a small gathering. A simple wooden altar had been set, marked only by a ribbon tied to a fence post, fluttering like a banner in the gentle breeze. A preacher stood solemnly, his hands clasped around a well-worn Bible. Around him, the cowboys' ranch hands shifted nervously, hats in hands, boots scuffing the earth. They were witnesses, not for show, but for loyalty and respect. At the center, the widow stood in a simple dress, her daughter clutching her mother's hand, eyes wide and bright. The cowboy approached, dust from his boots rising with each step, eyes steady, heart open. "Do you take this woman?" the preacher asked, voice echoing softly across the plains, "to stand with her in joy and sorrow, through hardship and hope?" "I do," the cowboy answered, voice firm, yet carrying a tenderness reserved for few. "And do you take this man?" The preacher turned to the widow, "to stand with him in life's trials, to share love and laughter as a family now and always?" "I do," she replied, tears catching the sunlight, sparkling like small stars on the wind. Her daughter smiled, a tiny hand waving, caught in the unspoken promise of safety, love and belonging. A hush fell over the gathered witnesses. The prairie seemed to hold its breath. Then quietly, the preacher spoke the words that made them one. "By the grace of God and the strength of the land, you are bound together." As the words settled, a soft murmur rippled through the town, carried by the wind, whispers not of scandal this time, but of respect. Even those who had once doubted the widow, or sneered at the cowboy, now held their tongues. Some watched from the edges, admiration threading their gazes. Among them, the banker lingered, pale and defeated, clutching his ledger like it could shield him from the truth. He had wielded power, but power could not bend hearts or rewrite courage. Later, as the sun dipped low, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber, the trio mounted their horses. The little girl perched between her mother and the cowboy, arms wrapped around both, laughter spilling over like a song long silenced. Dust trailed behind them, catching the last light, shimmering like embers of a fire that had refused to die. They rode together, the horizon swallowing them in its glow, the wind whispering promises only the open land could keep. Each hoofbeat was a drumbeat of freedom, each glance a reassurance of love earned and defended. A voice soft and reflective lingered as they disappeared into the sunset. That night's fire gave them more than warmth. It gave them a home, a name, and forever. And in that firelight, the prairie held them, a family unbroken, unbowed, and bound by more than blood or soil, bound by courage, by heart, and by the quiet, enduring magic of the land they now called their own.